don't go believing anything I say. No, don't go believing me. No, don't listen to me, don't take any notice. Don't listen to anything that I say, thank you.
We started buying in February. From the middle of February, the British embassy in Beijing stood up a team to buy PPE.
So we've got an embassy in Beijing, and they knew absolutely nothing about what was going on in Wuhan. But there were videos being released through people using VPN and releasing this stuff. And we all saw it, but you lot didn't.
How did you work with, because Mr. Cummings explained chaos and I think a clash of egos behind the scenes at Number 10 between different departments. How did your department work with the Cabinet Office, say, and the Treasury?
Great. I mean, I have an exemplary relationship with Michael, who's been a stalwart of the efforts. Stalwart. And incredibly helpful. And when it comes to Treasury, the amount of money that the Treasury have put into this problem is unprecedented. And when I had problems, I raised it with ministers, and they were normally resolved. And if they weren't, that was because there was a perfectly decent reason. That's how government works.
How comfy is a 20 grand toilet seat? I'd like to know.
That's a very different picture to the one that we heard. But do you think that Mr. Cummings' business relationship with Michael Gove was a reason for him being perhaps less critical? I mean, he barely mentioned him throughout the testimony, but gave you, I would say, a fairly rough ride during the 7 hours. Do you think it's fair to say that perhaps has clouded his judgment?
Well, I'm not responsible for anybody else's testimony, but I am really pleased to have the chance to come here to be able to tell you the truth.
And by extension, call the other guy a liar.
Final question, and it just relates to a question that my colleague Barbara Keeley raised, and I don't think we got to the nub of the answer. You've referred earlier in the session to saying that patients from hospitals were released to care homes because it took 4 days to test.
4 days to test. Yet he's going to say something a bit later. That means it's 3 weeks. Because the test doesn't mean anything. Honestly, it doesn't.
And you just justified the discharge policy without testing on that. But on the 11th of March in 2020, the NHS website said that the majority of tests were being turned around in 24 hours. Now, which one is the truth? Is it 4 days, or was it the NHS's website which says quite clearly the majority of tests were being turned around in 24 hours?
Yes, I answered this question around an hour ago.
Didn't answer it, which is why I'm asking again, sorry.
No, I answered this question around an hour ago, and I'll repeat my answer then, which is that if the tests can take up to 4 days to come through, not all of them came through within 24 hours, but even if, whatever the time period, the point is the same, is that you can catch COVID in a hospital after taking a test before getting the result. And critically, what I'd say is that is only one part of the reason that the decisions were taken, and those decisions were all taken on clinical advice.
Hiding behind clinical advice.
I think it's really important if we're going to learn the lessons to know, if people who have special access, he's calling you Matt, if people have very special access to Secretary of State's, how that works in the supply chain and how that works in terms of public procurement. There are several emails from, it came from your department, from Samir Jasal and Surbjit Jasal, and I think Samir was acting as a middleman, and Surbjit company went from £200 in value to almost £10 million in value, from £200 in value to almost £10 million in value, from £200 in value to almost £10 million in value in the year of the pandemic. Were you aware of that?
No, but when people brought forward proposals for PPE, to be able to supply PPE, I passed them on to the team who took them forward, and decisions on individual contracts were made by officials. And I think anybody...
So you'd always pass them on, you wouldn't have a private conversation or email exchange with, say, Mr. Giselle?
Well, it depended on the circumstances, but I would pass on an offer and then the team would look into it. That's how this worked. And,
okay.
And if you think about it, obviously I would, because if I did the opposite and ignored likely offers of PPE, then I'd rightly be criticised.
I completely agree. I just wondered why you would have time to give special attention to an individual person. Can I quickly just touch on, you spoke earlier about people being very enthusiastic to give their data. I think you're over-exaggerating how enthusiastic people are about just giving carte blanche access to their data. Are you aware that Palantir and faculty have links to the discredited Cambridge Analytica? Are you aware that Palantir and faculty have links to the discredited Cambridge Analytica?
I'm not. I'm not. I don't think I'm aware of that. No.
Completely unprepared, wasn't expecting that, really shot him straight between the fucking eyes.
Okay, I think it's really vital that you should be aware of that. I mean, it's, Palantir reportedly taught Cambridge Analytica how to scrape data. That means that you are putting at risk everybody's data in the country and giving it to organisations such as Palantir.
No,
I think it's really important that you get to grips with that. And I will give you this little book of data and democracy and some information for you to help inform you, Secretary of State. Just a couple of quick yes or no responses. Do you have any other agreements with companies that will help supply data that will help analyse voting intentions?
I have no idea what you're asking about.
I have no idea what you're asking about.
I'm asking about, in our previous session, when you came in front of the committee, I asked you about unsolicited questionnaires that were being sent to people, asking them how they intended to vote in the next election. You said you didn't know anything about that. Now we know more about Palantir's and faculty's involvement in the NHS. It seems like this is all could be used as part of a way to get data about how people are going to vote and to encourage people to vote a certain way.
Sorry, is this relevant to coronavirus lessons learned inquiry that we're doing? Because we do need to make sure the questions are on that topic.
Yeah, it is, Chair, because I think the lessons that we must take from this pandemic is that in a pandemic, we cannot use this as a shield to be able to get people's data, to be able to use with it whatever a government wants to use it for.
Okay.
The lessons that we must take from this pandemic is that in a pandemic, we cannot use this as a shield to be able to get people's data, to be able to use with it whatever a government wants to use it for.
Okay. Do you want to then ask your final questions then?
Secretary of State, are you 100% sure that Palantir, faculty, Cambridge Analytica or any other offshoot companies are not supplying public data, voting intentions, anything like that to the Conservative Party?
Well, what I'd say is that this has absolutely nothing to do with it. And where your accusations are unfounded and wrong is when you said that the companies involved in improving the way that we use data in government and have made huge positive strides in doing this in the last year and a half, that those companies, the words you used were have carte blanche, and that is not true, because all of this work is done within strict, careful protocols to make sure that we can use data to save lives. That's what I was doing, and I know that there are various theories in this space You've asked me the question, and I'll answer it.
This is not a theory, Secretary of State.
There are various theories in this. What matters is, can you use data better to save lives, ensuring that it is properly and appropriately protected, and that's what we do.
Secretary of State, 100%.
Last question, if we may.
Secretary, 100% you can use data to save lives. Of course you can. You can also use data to manipulate people and manipulate lives, and that is not where we want to go as a country or as a government. So this isn't about theories. These are about factuals. These are about how you use data.
The final thing I'll say on this, because I know you want to move on, Chair, is that the data on your personal health, your health record, in my view, that belongs emphatically to you. In my view, that belongs emphatically to you.
Your view doesn't mean shit. If you put it in writing and put it in legislation, your view doesn't mean shit.
It doesn't belong to your GP, it doesn't belong to the NHS, that is your data. And people should be able to care for you based on that data, and if you want it to be used for research purposes, that's your decision.
May I ask one very small question, if I may? It just relates to when we look at organisations like Apple that are excellent at collecting data and have the tools and facilities to do that. Do you see an opportunity to sort of partner more with those sorts of big organisations who are already tracking people's heartbeats and say, look, could we find a way to help that improve people's health as well?
Well, up to a point, but what really matters here is that we can maintain people's trust and consent in the process. Personally, I'd be very happy to do that. But we need to bring people with us on this one. We need to bring people with us on this one. We need to bring people with us on this one.
Thank you.
On that one, did you, as was reported, overrule your officials on the Oxford AstraZeneca order and increase it from 30 million to 100 million? Was that a personal interference that you made?
Well, yes, but it's unfair to say that was overruling. The advice was to buy 30 million doses. I said that we needed to make sure we had enough for the whole adult population, even if other vaccines came off. And so I decided that we needed 100 million.
Roughly 66 million people in the UK, and he needs 100 million just to vaccinate the adult population. That's the quality of this person's math.
And then got agreement with that across Whitehall. There were other areas, for instance, Oxford University, who of course have done this brilliantly, were initially lined up with a different vaccine company, but I was determined that we would have UK manufacture with a UK provider, and critically make sure that we had an exclusive contract to those critical early doses. And when the other manufacturer was not willing to sign up to those conditions, we switched to AstraZeneca, and Oxford signed the deal with AstraZeneca with government support, and the rest is history. So, I had my red lines on this, and I provided the resources and the leadership. I provided the resources and the leadership. Because you have to make sure you have the clinical confidence in safety and efficacy, otherwise things wouldn't work. And the proof point of that is that we managed to get the vaccine at record times, but we still have uptake in 96, 97%. We have the highest enthusiasm for vaccines in the world because we took the approach that we did. And we didn't either just remove steps that were required for safety, and we didn't stop clinical trials early as they did in some other countries.
Wait for what he says next.
On hydroxychloroquine, you might remember,
yes,
some quite influential figures decided early that it was obviously right, and declared victory on it. But when the recovery trial saw it through to the end, when you got a clinically validated, statistically accurate answer, it found no benefit of hydroxychloroquine.
Only because they overdosed everybody. Funny that, isn't it?
You have to follow the science on this. You have to follow the science on this.
Yet they didn't follow the dosing procedure. It was set to fail. So they didn't follow the science on this.
And this is one of the areas where Britain absolutely nailed it. And political intervention to undermine that science would have been wrong. So I was willing to drive and intervene where it was appropriate, but I absolutely would not undermine the science in this area, and that's one of the reasons that it worked so well.
Okay, if I can just finish, this is lessons learned obviously for the UK, but I think there are lessons for the global scientific community. We've already talked earlier about some of the things that SAGE got wrong, that we got wrong internationally, that the WHO got wrong, that you were referring to the asymptomatic transmission. Do you think they got it wrong on the origins of the coronavirus? We've now seen this lab leak hypothesis is gaining a lot of credibility around the world with intelligence agencies and scientists.
Sorry, pal, but don't start giving those people the credit for something the public's pulled up. Sorry, you ain't taking credit for that. We've been pointing this out. You've all been stupid.
Do you think that the WHO let us down on that at the start of the pandemic?
Well, I don't know, and nobody knows. Well, I don't know, and nobody knows.
Of course they didn't let you down, if that's what you intended in the first place anyway. Come on, Billy Boy's little boy.
I know the clinical advice, and that is public. I know the clinical advice, and that is public.
Hiding behind clinical advice.
But I think it is vital that we have a fully independent investigation.
When he starts talking slow like this, it's because the cogs are turning, because he's hoping he doesn't get done for corporate manslaughter.
In China, in China, in China, in China.
Definitely not here. Not here. Please, please, not here. Don't let it be here.
Into finding out all we can about this, and that is allowed to happen unencumbered. And part of the reforms that we need to the way that
certain things were removed so you can't get done for crimes against humanity. Tony Blair knows a thing or two about that. But I've got to make it sound like we're not going to change the legislation or anything soon, because we can still be extradited and things under corporate manslaughter. So I've got to make it sound like we're not going to change anything soon. I hope they don't bring that victims bill in. We're knackered.
The worldwide systems operate is to make sure that we can properly find answers to these questions, because at the moment it is impossible to know. Because at the moment it is impossible to know.
It will be hard to get into China. Sorry, it will be hard to get into China, but do you feel let down by the way the British scientific establishment backed up the original position of the WHO without any real evidence for doing that?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think that we do need to get to the bottom of this. But of course, for the day-to-day management of a pandemic,
let's not talk about this any longer. Please, can we get back to the pandemic?
The origin is only a secondary consequence. What matters is the problem that you've got in front of you. Now, for learning the lessons and avoiding future pandemics, these things are very important.
Thank you.
Phew.
You've previously told our committee that a circuit breaker lockdown you felt was disproportionate. But it's also been reported that you yourself argued for that very circuit breaker. What is the truth of this? And if you're arguing for the circuit breaker lockdown, why did the Prime Minister reject your advice?
He didn't, and also that it misrepresents the way that governments make decisions of this magnitude. We have discussions of the pros and cons. Now, of course, as the Health Secretary, I am inclined to take the cautious view. That's my job. And my job was to protect lives and to get us out of it.
There may be trouble ahead.
That has been my central mission for the last 18 months, since the 1st of January, when I first heard about this virus, and certainly since it became clear that it was coming here a month or so later. And so of course I'm going to make the cautious arguments. Others make arguments for the absolutely serious, real and immediate costs of lockdown, as it was discussed.
My ass.
We did this on a regional basis over the autumn until November, We then had the national England-wide November lockdown, and then we had a regional approach over December until the January the 4th lockdown. And all that while, the situation got more difficult to manage because of the rising number of proportion of the Alpha variant, as colleagues from Kent, I'm sure, are delighted that it is now called.
Don't laugh. Don't laugh.
Okay, one of the points that Mr Cummings made repeatedly to our committee a fortnight ago was that decisions were taken by the Prime Minister himself, and he would ignore other people's opinions or advice on this. Is that the case? Is that your experience?
No, I discussed all these issues with the Prime Minister throughout. Yeah, I speak to the Prime Minister almost every day, usually several times a day, and have done since I first alerted him to this problem on the 7th of January. Since I first alerted him to this problem on the 7th of January. Since I first alerted him to this problem on the 7th of January.
So it took you 6 days to tell him?
You know, it's an incredibly intense period for any government, and remains so, because these judgments and the consequences of the judgments that we make affect everybody in the country. So this is and the way that decisions are made is through discussion. Of course, people have a tendency, one side of the argument or the other, at times. Actually, at the moment, everybody is very aligned, and the data is still not yet clear ahead of the 21st of June decision. But but the way that decisions are made is that they make their argument, and then the Prime Minister makes the decision, and then you fall in line behind that decision, because that's what collective agreement is all about. And then the Prime Minister makes the decision, and then the Prime Minister makes the decision, and then you fall in line behind that decision, because that's what collective agreement is all about. And ministers go out and explain it, and advisers advise. And ministers go out and explain it, and advisers advise. And ministers go out and explain it, and advisers advise.
So what we are trying to establish is whether the picture that was painted by Mr Cummings is a true reflection of what was taking place, whether it was a one-person decision, whether Cabinet were involved, what advice was being taken on board. This is really what I'm trying to get to.
Yes, and what I'd say is that I spoke directly to the Prime Minister throughout this period, and he took advice from a huge range of people, as he should and as he does.
Okay, the point of learning lessons is to identify where things have gone wrong, identify mistakes, and address these for future. Hopefully we won't have another global pandemic, but even for future dealings with COVID. What would you do differently? And
where to start? There's so much that we've learned. Okay, the best place to start is probably the things we do differently now to at the start. Right? We have different policies on protecting care homes. We have different policies on the border. We've learned a huge amount all the way through. So a lessons learned exercise is not.
I'm sorry. When we see 3 weeks for the border from India to be closed,
but you don't. Well, but you don't. You don't. We acted when we saw the data. And
the data showed from Public Health England shows that the Indian cases positivity from India was 3 times greater than the positivity from Bangladesh, but that data was not acted upon for 3 weeks.
Do you remember the 24-hour turnaround and the 4 days for the tests? Get ready for this.
But we didn't have that data because there is a long lag from the cases, the date on which the case occurs, to the date when the sequencing result comes back. But we didn't have that data because there is a long lag from the cases, the date on which the case occurs, to the date when the sequencing result comes back. But we didn't have that data because there is a long lag from the cases, the date on which the case occurs, to the date when the sequencing result comes back.
Now start questioning what they're actually looking for, because it sure as hell ain't no virus. You can guarantee that.
You have to act on the data that you have. I keep repeating this whenever I'm accused of, by somebody with the benefit of hindsight, that I should have acted sooner.
You see, it's all COVID. This is what they explained early on. It doesn't really matter which chunk of it you get. You're only getting little variations in it. So whatever they're actually looking for should be easy to find, because it's the main chunk of the thing. But no, they don't have that. They have to go through sequencing. See, testing, essentially, means jack shit.
And I've tried to stress it during this whole...
I think many people were asking to act sooner in the early days of April, and that didn't happen. But
well, you know, the different governments across the United Kingdom, including the SNP government, acted at the same time in these things, because we were acting based on the same scientific advice.
No, that's not true. The SNP government closed the borders. No, that's not true. The SNP government closed the borders.
We're going to conclude.
You were referring to the period of March and April last year, and we all had the same.
No,
scientific advice.
I'm talking about April of this year.
Do you want to come back on that, or should we move on?
Well, the government in Scotland took a different approach, and international travel is essentially, the rules around international travel are essentially a decision for the UK government. But I'm not particularly.
Could another reason be that with an airborne virus, some hospital ventilation systems just weren't good enough?
Yes, that is definitely another lesson as well.
Could another reason be that with an airborne virus, Airborne?
My ass.
Perhaps looking back, given that we want to learn lessons that can be applied during the remainder of this pandemic as well as in the future, if we were to have, God forbid, a vaccine escape, that's to say a new variant that was resistant to the vaccines that we have.
The vaccine doesn't stop you recreating the virus. It only stops you getting the sniffles and having adverse effects from it. It's still going around. That's why you could still get the virus, even though you'd had 2 jabs.
Do you have a plan for that?
Yes. It is the life of a health secretary to worry about these things. The plan is predicated on having a variant vaccine as fast as possible. Now, the Prime Minister set a target of having a variant vaccine and treatment and diagnostics within 100 days, but we are not there yet at that speed of turnaround. However, the mRNA technologies, as the Chair set out, can develop a vaccine for an individual new DNA or RNA sequence.
They're now looking for changes in your DNA since you've had the jab. That's what they're now looking for. That's why they still want you to continue testing even though you've had the jab. They want to know that it's changed your DNA.
DNA or RNA sequence. DNA or RNA sequence very quickly, within a matter of days. Vaccine escape is a relative, not an absolute concept.
Is it this one?
A relative, not an absolute concept.
Or is it this one?
So we know that variants do respond differently to the vaccine, given that the current vaccines were all aimed at the original Wuhan strain. And so we know, for instance, that a single dose of either Astra, Oxford or Pfizer is less effective in terms of reducing transmission on the Delta variant, but is less effective in terms of reducing transmission on the Delta variant, is less effective in terms of reducing transmission on the Delta variant. But we know that a double jab is statistically insignificantly different. Statistically insignificantly different. Insignificantly different. Insignificantly different. Insignificantly different.
Thank you, Chair.
Anam Kaiser-Javid.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for joining us today, Secretary. So whether it's policy implementation or the general workings of the UK Government, or even in your role as Secretary of State for Health, public trust is of paramount importance. Getting those key lines right, ensuring that communication is clear and maintaining that trust so that the general public have faith in leadership of the country. Would you agree with that statement?
I very strongly agree with it, yeah.
So then why, during the pandemic, do you think that the Prime Minister had lower approval ratings in comparison to his counterparts of devolved nations?
Because he was listening to this muppet, one of the 4 horsemen of the COVID apocalypse, making him stupid.
Well, I don't think it's about approval. I think it's about, as you say, public trust. And we worked very hard to ensure that we had the support of the public. And in fact, when you look at the proof point of that, the consequence of that, the public have been incredibly strong in supporting the measures that we asked them to support.
My ass.
And ultimately, that's what you need the trust for. And then perhaps the most important factor when it comes to having the trust of the public is to make sure we get very, very high vaccination uptake.
My ass.
And I've already said that I think that the operation of government has improved very significantly since November, and the public have definitely noticed that.
Yeah, we notice how you lot operate.
And in fact, the public trust across the UK in the measures that the government have taken has increased significantly.
What a waste of time.
Now, I've noticed as Secretary of State that it is now more efficient, more effective, there's better communication inside of government, there's a better sense of teamwork.
Well, ask your great mates to help me.
All right, we got to take him upstairs and hide him in the cupboard.
No, don't tell them.
And that is so important in a pandemic. And the public have undoubtedly noticed this improvement over the past 6 months or so.
Television.
I know.
It's amazing to think that's all some people's lives revolve around.
Do you think that the public trust you?
I hate you! Go away and crawl away and die in a ditch somewhere, you bastard!
Well, I think
Secretary of State.
you can judge that for yourself. And
I'm asking you, what would you?
Well, I think all I can say is that the approach I've taken throughout this is to try to answer questions as directly and straight as possible.
Oh.
I'm a big team player.
I'm sorry, I'm a twat.
I'm willing to say difficult things if necessary.
God, you're weird, aren't you? I mean, you're really weird.
And that is I think the best approach you can take in the pandemic, answering difficult questions and answering the questions that are easier to answer. You know, when difficult things happen, my approach is to
I'll try from a different angle.
go to the dispatch box or have a press conference and explain why there's a difficult thing.
Tell me about this road sign. Sounds great.
Well, they put up this new road sign which says give way. But, the thing is, the old one said give way as well, so there's no real difference. They're just the same. So what I was saying was, why did they put up the new one? And I mean, everything would have just been the same.
And I think that's important in a pandemic in particular. But at the same time, I'm a huge team player, and I think it's very important that we operate as best as we can as a team.
I mean, how could you fake
like something like that. I was joking!
Rewinding back at the session that we had with Mr Cummings a couple of weeks ago, he claimed, whilst I was questioning him on borders, that the Prime Minister in the UK government prioritised the economy over people's lives. Now that's quite a damaging allegation, but that allegation was made. I'm not going to question you on the validity of that, but what I'm going to ask you is, statements like that have been made, what actions are the UK government going to take to maintain or regain trust from the public?
Well, the honest truth in response to that is that we have some of the toughest border measures in the world.
Welcome one and welcome all! Who on earth are you?
And people can see that we're willing to take difficult decisions on borders based on the data, if that's what's needed. So, for instance, just last week, we had to remove Portugal from the green list of countries, despite the fact that that was very uncomfortable. And there were lots of people who were, especially who were on holiday or out in Portugal on business, whom that had a significant impact on. But when the data changes, then we are willing to make those difficult decisions because we have a tough approach at the borders.